Funding for In the Garden is provided by UNC TV members and by academic programs and North Carolina Cooperative Extension. Both are members of the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences at North Carolina State University.
Hi, and welcome to In the Garden. I'm Bryce Lane. And folks, I've got my loppers, my pruning saw, got my hand pruners strapped on my belt, and I've got shrubs that need pruning. Today's show, we're going to talk all about the different techniques we use to prune in our own gardens. Well, now that we've talked about when to prune and the different reasons why you should prune, what I'd really like to do now is focus in on how to prune. So where are we going to start? Well, I think the best place to start is to talk about something called selective pruning. Now, the opposite of selective pruning is what you would call non-selective pruning. Now, what's the difference here? Selective pruning involves literally making a choice, making a selection of what you're going to prune, where non-selective pruning involves just cutting without any respect to the way the plant is made up. See if we can explain it a little bit more clearly. The first thing that selective pruning involves is choosing the right tool. Now, folks, there are a number of different pruning tools, and last show we talked about the different pruning tools you can use. It's really important to select the right tool for the right type of pruning that you're doing. That way, when you make the selection for the cut that you're going to make, you'll have the correct tool to do that. Classic example of using the wrong tool would be using those hedge trimmers to do some very minute selective pruning. So that's the first thing, is to select the right tool. The second is to select the right plant. Now, what I mean by select the right plant is to know what type of plant you're dealing with, to understand how it grows. And if you remember last show, we talked a little bit about understanding what the plant's going to do when it grows, whether it's going to flower or flush first. And that way, if we understand the plant, we'll be able to make the right selective cut. The third aspect is making the right choice. Folks, selective pruning is all about choosing. Now, this involves using your head, and that means actually thinking about the pruning that you're going to be doing, making the choice, and the result that you're going to get by that choice. And of course, the choice you're going to make is not just the location of the cut, but choosing the right cut. And what we're going to talk about in this section here is actually how to prune using the correct cuts. So you see, selective pruning is all about choosing the right things relative to what we want to do with that particular plant. But there's a basic theme we want to remember when we're pruning. And that basic theme goes something like this. We want to try to maintain the natural shape of the tree or shrub that we're pruning when we prune. And if we always are thinking about the natural shape of that particular plant, then it becomes really important to try to maintain that natural shape, unless we're going to be pruning that plant in a way that is not natural, a strange shape. What I thought I'd do is show you a couple examples of when you would prune and not have it adhere to the natural shape of that particular plant. Let's take a look. One of the most common pruning methods that's used to create unique and unusual shapes is called topiary. And I'm sure many of you have been down to Disney World and seen shrubs or trees that have literally been carved into shapes, geometric shapes or animals and whatnot. Well, true topiary actually takes a plant and prunes it in a very unnatural way. Here in this picture you can see very interesting, unusual geometric shapes and some fascinating shapes that have been pruned using the topiary method. Now, this particular garden is located in northern England. It's a place called Levens Hall, and it is the oldest topiary garden in the world. dates back to the mid-1600s. These plants have been pruned and trained like this over a period of time. But you can see that the type of pruning that is done on these particular plants is not natural. And as a result, you might be using non-selective pruning. You're not really thinking about the exact location of the cut. You're using a tool that's going to cut or carve that particular plant. But here you can see a typical shot at Levens Hall. If we get a little bit closer, we can see how the plants respond to that non-selective pruning. Here on the right is a boxwood that had been pruned in such a fashion that this growth from here to the top represents about 30 or 40 years of selective and non-selective pruning to create that shape. And here on the left, this large tree with the skirt around the base. You can think about what type of pruning's been involved with the topiaries. Now, sometimes you can visit gardens that have just pieces of topiary involved. I was at a British garden just recently, and I walked around into this particular area, and there's that face looking right at me. So that was kind of unique. Second type of pruning that's unique and shapes plants in unnatural forms is what we call espalier, where we literally train plants in a two-dimensional fashion. Here you can see the rows on the wall, and in this particular backside of a small home, these roses have been trained in a two-dimensional fashion along the line. Now, there's one other type of pruning that's unnatural that I want to show you that Europeans use quite a bit, and it's called pollarding. And in this case, they take a mature tree and stub it back. Now, this is not good pruning, unless, of course, you commit to starting that pruning method when the trees are young, and then you continually go back to the same spot every spring and cut all the branches back to that spot. So what's the accomplishment? Well, here you can see in a courtyard in Italy, these plants are starting to leaf out and creates a thicker, more unique and ornamental canopy. So those would be the times where maybe the pruning method that you use does not adhere to the natural shape of the particular plant. Well, we want to talk about pruning cuts, and we're going to go out in the field and actually demonstrate these cuts. But here are the three cuts that we want to think about when we're pruning. The first cut is called heading back, and we'll show you exactly what's involved with that type of cut. The second cut is called thinning out, and we'll demonstrate that as well. And the third cut is called drop crotching. And I know that sounds kind of funny, but when we get out in the field, we'll show you exactly how to do a proper drop crotching cut. So this is where we're headed, how to prune with these specific cuts. Now, when we talk about using specific pruning cuts on trees and shrubs, it's really important to remember this, that for every pruning cut you make, it's going to stimulate a certain kind of growth response. And so when we talk about selective pruning, we want to be sure that we understand the kind of growth we're going to get when we do a particular cut. Now, the first cut that we identified is called heading back. And let's see if I can go ahead and explain that to you. When we use a heading back cut, it's basically very simple. You follow a stem back to an outward-facing bud. It's really important, folks, to identify the buds along a stem and then consider where you want to reduce the size and then go ahead and cut just above an outward-facing bud. Now, you might be saying, why an outward-facing bud and not an inward-facing bud? And what do you mean by that? Well, an inward-facing bud is going to break, as we say. It'll start to grow after we cut. If we cut above an inward-facing bud, it's going to grow in toward the middle of the shrub. And of course, you know that always equals a deranged branch, which would have to be removed later. Whereas an outward-facing bud will grow outward and increase or improve that natural habit of that particular shrub. So let me see if I can go ahead and demonstrate the heading back cut. Start here at the top of the stem, move back, there's the outward-facing bud, and that's about where I want to cut it. I'm going to come in with my pruners and I'm going to cut just above that outward-facing bud, like that. So there's the bud. It's going to sprout next spring, and it'll grow out this way, away from the center of the shrub. Now, you might say, well, that's just a little bit of a stem. Can you drastically cut stems back using heading back? Sure, you've just got to find those buds. I come back here. There's a bud there. There's an outward-facing bud. I'm going to cut right there. You can see I've reduced the size significantly. That bud's going to break next spring and grow out this way. Now, some of you might be wondering, why do you cut above a bud? Why can't you indiscriminately just cut on the stem? Well, first of all, that's non-selective pruning. And secondly, what that leaves is a stub. And it's not a good thing when you prune to leave a stub. You see, a stub's not going to grow. It's just going to sit there. It'll end up dying. The bud below the stub is going to grow out. That stub becomes an interesting place where diseases and insects can infect the plant. So remember, when you do a heading back cut, always cut to an outward facing bud. Well, now the second type of pruning cut is called thinning out. Now the thinning out pruning cut is a pruning cut that you should only use on a specific kind of plant. That would be a deciduous shrub like this one here. Now this is Calycanthus, also known as sweet shrub, and it's a classic deciduous growing shrub. It's multi-stemmed, and folks, over time you can see that some of these stems get quite large and burly. And what happens is the shrub gets overgrown and it doesn't look very good anymore. So you use the thinning out cut to create a smaller, more likable looking shrub. Now thinning out cut is very simple. You basically find the oldest and largest branches in a multi-stem shrub, follow them all the way down to the ground and cut them at ground level. Remember, for every pruning cut you make, that stimulates a growth response. And so when you cut down at ground level, basically what happens is you get young, new shoots coming from the inside out and from ground level to create that new shrub. So I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate this on a couple of the larger and older branches. Got my loppers here. I'm going to take this branch out right here. I'm going to come in here and cut it right there and pull it right out. So you can see there are already some younger branches growing in there, but I'm going to continue the process with this one back in here, come in and cut it out. So you can see I'm already reducing quite a bit of that large burly area. Now this particular one here has got to go too, but the loppers are just too big, or too small rather, and so I'm going to take the saw, the pruning saw, and cut this out here. Here we go. You've got to have a good sharp pruning saw in order to get through it quickly. Let me stand up and move that out of the way so you can see how much growth has been taken out. So here I've just taken 3 thinning out cuts, cut them down to ground level. New growth is going to come in through here. If I were going to continue this process, I would take out these other larger branches as well. New growth here, and it really rejuvenates the shrub. It ends up looking great. Second cut, thinning out. Remember, use it on deciduous shrubs only. If you do this on evergreen shrubs, chances are there's not going to be that kind of regrowth that occurs from ground level. So it's a specific kind of cut you use selectively. Well, now the third type of pruning cut is by far the most important pruning cut that we can practice in our own gardens, and it's called drop crotching. Now I know that sounds a little bit funny, but if you think about it, take a look at this stem. We'll define what the word crotch is when it comes to plant anatomy. Folks, a crotch is where one branch meets another. This point of attachment right here, that's the crotch. So the idea behind drop crotching is that we're going to remove one of these 2 branches back to where it meets the other, henceforth drop crotching. Now the whole idea behind this type of pruning method is that the growth response that comes from pruning branches back to where they meet another is that you get a well-distributed growth response throughout the entire tree or shrub that you're pruning using drop crotching. Not only that, but you can control size, you can remove the 4 Ds, dead, diseased, damaged, and deranged branches, and no one would ever know that you've pruned it. So let me go ahead and demonstrate drop crotching and then show you how you can use drop crotching and heading back to go ahead and do a good pruning on a particular plant. So I'm going to take my pruner, and this is the essence of selective pruning, because at this point when I come to the crotch, I make a selection. I decide which branch is going to stay and which branch is going to go. In this case, I'm trying to control size. I'm going to take the longer and the larger branch back to where it meets another and cut right there. I've just drop crotched that branch, and you can see now it's smaller. The growth response is going to be right in this area where branches will grow out. So now, if I can, what I thought I would do on this particular shrub, it's a hibiscus, is just go through and demonstrate how drop crotching can control size. I'm going to take a look at this branch right here. Now, selective pruning, folks, always takes time. You can see I might choose here, I might choose here, or I might choose down here, or if I really wanted to be drastic, this crotch down here may represent where I'd want to cut. In fact, I think I'm going to go ahead and select this one. So I'm going to cut right there. All right, you see I'm beginning to control size. But look at this branch right here. Again, drop crotching, you can come down to here or down to this area. I'm going to come right there. And so you can see how the size is beginning to get smaller. In this case, you might cut here, or you could come all the way back to here. I'm going to go the drastic route and cut right there. Now folks, sometimes drop crotching doesn't necessarily accomplish the goal. And that's when you can go back and use heading back. For instance, on this particular branch, if you drop crotched here, that wouldn't be far enough down. But if you drop crotched way down here, that would be too far. So I'm going to find an outward facing bud right there, and I'm going to cut using the heading back cut. And now I've decreased the size a little bit. But to conclude, if you want to control size and remove the 4Ds when you're pruning, drop crotching is the most important cut that you can make, and you can do it without really changing the natural shape of the particular shrub. Then you use heading back as a means by which to clean up the drop crotching in places where drop crotching wouldn't necessarily work. So folks, remember, drop crotching, heading back for most of your pruning in trees and shrubs, and then thinning out when you're going to take multi-stem deciduous shrubs and rejuvenate them. But those are the 3 basic cuts. Well, folks, we're often faced with a challenge of having to cut a large branch off the main trunk of a tree. And oftentimes in the past, what happens is people would go ahead and start pruning that branch as close as they could to that main trunk. But it's a heavy branch and it begins to pull away. Oftentimes what happens is, as the branch pulls away before you can cut all the way through, it pulls a large section of bark away from the main trunk, leaving a large wound. So there's a special pruning cut that we recommend for pruning large branches off main trunks, and it's called the 3-cut method. It involves 3 separate cuts that keeps that from happening. Let me go ahead and demonstrate for you. Now, the first cut should be made on the bottom of the branch, about 2 to 3, maybe even 4 or 5 inches away from the main trunk. And what I'm going to do is demonstrate here. Now, when you make the cut, you cut in only about 1/3 of the way into the branch. You're not going to be cutting all the way through because it would pinch your saw. So there you have it. There's the first cut. It's at least 1/3 of the way in. That's cut number 1. Now, cut number 2 occurs on the top, just a little bit to the inside of cut 1. So we're going to cut right here. And if we're doing this correctly, what we'll see is that most of the branch, there we go, falls right off. Perfectly done, you see. Now what's left is what we call a stub. And of course, in pruning, we know you never leave the stub. So now we need to make cut number 3, and that's to prune the stub off. Now we don't have as much weight, so it's not going to pull the bark down on the bottom. Now, one thing you want to remember when you cut the stubs off, there are 2 choices that you have when you cut. One, you could cut very close and flush to the main trunk. Of course, if you cut there, folks, look how big that wound is going to be when you cut that close. Or secondly, and this is the recommended cut, you cut at what's called the branch collar. If you look carefully here where this branch attaches to the main trunk, you can see an area where it forms a collar or a circle here where it moves in. It's kind of like where your arm attaches to your shoulder. Research has shown that when you cut at the branch collar, that wound will close a whole lot faster. So let me go ahead and demonstrate. I'm going to go ahead and cut right through here. And we're just about, there we go. And so you see I've cut at the branch collar, leaving a little bit of a lump there, if you will. But research shows, again, that this will close up faster. Now, I know, to finish, many of you are thinking about, well, what kind of pruning paint should be placed on that wound? Once again, research shows pruning paint is detrimental for wound closure. The best thing you can do for this wound is just leave it clean like this, and it'll close right up. So there you have it, the 3-cut method for pruning large branches off the main trunks of trees. And you know, folks, I'm a little winded. Well, I'm in the process of cutting back this herbaceous perennial. This is called Amsonia, and it's already died back to the ground and will overwinter in the soil. But folks, this time of year, as winter progresses, this would be the time to go ahead and assess your herbaceous perennials, and as they die back to the ground, to go ahead and maybe get a head start on early spring and go ahead and cut those branches and the stems back to the ground. And then if you're concerned about protecting them in the winter, you could put a little bit of mulch over that herbaceous perennial to protect it from a real severe winter. But speaking of cutting things to the ground, I'd like to share one last pruning technique with you when it comes to some of the smaller flowering deciduous shrubs that we grow in our garden, namely the spireas. Now, spirea is a group of plants that has wonderful small growing shrub with small pink and white flowers, a number of different cultivars with wonderful foliage colors in the spring and in the fall. This one's got a halfway decent fall color. Well, the only problem with some of these small shrubs that you see here is that they tend to get somewhat overgrown for small areas. So I like to practice what I call a complete rejuvenation prune. Now folks, the time that you do it to these deciduous shrubs is in March, right before they start to sprout. But I'd like to go ahead and demonstrate what exactly I do. Basically, it's simple. You take a shrub like this, cut it all the way to the ground. That's right. Take your hand pruners and go in and just begin cutting and removing the branches all the way as close as you can get to ground level. It seems drastic, and I know a lot of you might have a hard time psychologically doing this, thinking that, oh my goodness, I'm killing the plant, it's not going to rejuvenate. Well, folks, I've been doing this technique with spirea now for years, and it grows up to full size and flowers and performs just like any other spirea. But the great thing about it is it stays confined to a small space in the garden. So that's what we call the rejuvenation prune method, and that's something we really need to consider, especially in central and eastern North Carolina for small flowering deciduous shrubs. Well, I'm just getting ready to plant our plant of the week. Folks, our plant of the week is Mahonia media winter sun, the winter sun Mahonia, and it was suggested to us from Will Keith in Raleigh, North Carolina. And Will will send you an In the Garden t-shirt. Folks, don't forget, keep sending those suggestions in, and if we use one on the air, we'll send you a nice t-shirt as well. Well, let's talk about Mahonia media winter sun. The winter sun Mahonia is a group of cultivars, is one of a group of cultivars that has beautiful yellow flowers in December and January. It's an evergreen plant that has very, very spiny leaves, and it's multi-stemmed. Now, why winter sun? Why is this cultivar selected? Couple of things. One, it has a beautiful inflorescence of yellow flowers, very thick and verdant, and the yellow flowers start at the base and move all the way out. So in December and January, when a lot of things aren't in flower, this is just beautiful. The second thing is winter sun tends to be a little bit more compact than some of the other cultivars. If you take a look behind me, you see I'm starting a little Mahonia collection in my own garden. That's Mahonia media underway. And you'll notice the leaves are a little bit bigger and shinier, and the plant's a little bit taller, and it tends to grow taller. But it still has those lovely yellow flowers as well. Well, this plant will tolerate partial shade to partial sun, okay, well-drained soil. It doesn't need a whole lot of fertilizing or fertility. Once it gets established in the soil, it does great. It's wonderful for a barrier plant, border. You can use it in a mixed shrub border. I've got it in a natural area that I'm using it in. It's a fabulous plant for the landscape. The only thing you need to be careful about are those spiny leaves. It's a great plant of the week, Mahonia media winter sun. Well, folks, we've run out of time for this week. So until next time, I'll be looking for you in the garden. Excuse me, I'm going to go ahead and plant this now.
To register for In the Garden, the course, call NC State's Distance Education Program at 1-866-GO-STATE. That's 1-866-467-8283. Or log on to distance.ncsu.edu. For more information about the program or to suggest a plant of the week, go to unctv.org/inthegarden.
Funding for In the Garden is provided by UNC TV members and by academic programs and North Carolina Cooperative Extension. Both are members of the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences at North Carolina State University.